turn to the book of the Revelation, if you would please. This morning we'll begin a series of messages entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Our first message in this series is entitled, Be Prepared for What Is to Come. Now let me introduce the message to you this morning. In the Bible, there is a clear prophetic call. You see, in the Bible, history is linear. That means it had a point of beginning and it will have a point of ending. You see, history is moving toward a goal. Theologians call this the consummation. Now, it's not uncommon for Christians to talk about signs of the times. But I must say that for most believers, it seems to me just to be talk. You see, to them, the return of Christ is to be studied in the conclaves of the church. It's a doctrine for conversational fodder. But my brothers and sisters, it's much more than this. You see, Jesus' birth separated history as we know it today in BC and AD. But when Jesus returns, there will be an eternal mark that distinguishes all time. If you will, it will be measured by BR before the return and AR after the return. Now the Lord gives us help to prepare for this watershed moment in history. There is a plethora of passages in the Bible that speak about the prophetic end. Take the New Testament alone, for example. Mark 13, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and of course, the complete book of the Revelation. You see, God desires us to be prepared for the end. And I believe He is using this pandemic, at least in part, to prepare us for end times. Now you say, well, why so? Well, you see, many events associated with end times are not pleasant. What we've experienced in the last few weeks certainly is not pleasant. The book of Revelation describes cataclysmic events of nature, pestilences, hardships, wars, and death, the rise of a world leader, and the persecution of God's people. You see, believing that the time of the end is growing near, why wouldn't God use the events of our world along with the truth of Scripture that guides and navigates us to prepare for the end? Now today I'm going to share with you what I believe the book of Revelation has to say about the end times, at least as it parallels our time amidst this COVID-19 pandemic. You see, what we've experienced in the last several weeks is a foreshadowing of what is to come, at least in part. And we need to understand the incredible truth of the book of the Revelation. So turn to chapter 6 if you would. And today we're going to spend our time looking at three commonalities of what we've experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic and what the end times reveals. Commonality number one, spiritual isolation. Spiritual isolation. You see, spiritual isolation comes from a lack of church gatherings. Now, Christians have had a foretaste of spiritual isolation from the inability to assemble. You know, it wasn't very long here at Liberty that we began to feel the loss of intimate fellowship. It didn't take us long here at Liberty because we love to hug on one another. We love to connect with one another. And we love to be in close community with one another. It didn't take us long to feel spiritual isolation. Now, spiritual isolation comes at different levels. There are some among our church family that have continued to do their very best to remain socially and spiritually connected with one another. I mean, we here have folks that have used the phone and called members to remain connected. We have Zoom conferences for small group Bible studies and some of our small ministries. You heard from Brother George a moment ago about our D groups have been meeting via Zoom conferencing. Our mom's ministry has been meeting via Zoom conferencing. And we have had online services, online Bible studies, so that people can continue to be spiritually connected, first of all with our Father, and then, of course, with one another. But I'm absolutely certain there are some that's not fared so well. I'm absolutely certain that there have been some in the past that were regular worshipers who now have sensed and felt spiritually isolated. And when you do, you feel alone. You start feeling vulnerable. You start feeling spiritually weak. Now, spiritual isolation from this pandemic has occurred out of the desire to keep people safe. You know, we've done all of this to keep people safe. We have tape that marks off half of our worship center so you'll distance from one another, so you'll be safe. The world's economy has nearly collapsed for one reason, and that is to keep people safe. The day will come, my brothers and sisters, when believers all across the globe will once again feel the need to keep safe. And it won't be a virus, but a villain that we will hide from. And he is known as the beast in the book of Revelation, also known as the Antichrist. Now, the most severe form of spiritual isolation that has occurred among Christ's followers throughout time has been from persecution and martyrdom. You see, this is not new to our faith. The fifth seal of Revelation chapter 6 represents Christian martyrdom throughout the ages. So turn to Revelation 6 verse 9. Revelation 6 verse 9. When the Lamb, being Jesus, broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar, this was in heaven, the souls of those who had been slain. Why? Because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. According to Gordon Conwell Center for the Study of Global Christianity, 90,000 Christians died for their faith last year alone. Brothers and sisters, this represents a death of a Christ follower every 6 minutes last year. Now, historically, how do Christ followers, how do believers, how do Christians respond in times of persecution and martyrdom? All the way from the book of Acts, when persecution began by the man named Saul, there was a scattering and there was a bit of hiding from those that sought their lives. Now, I want you to understand that martyrdom occurs during the Great Tribulation. This is not new. You understand this. Chapter 7, verses 9 through 17, describes a multitude of believers that come out of the Great Tribulation. And turn, if you would, to chapter 7, verse 9. Well, let's read about it. Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. A very, very important verse in understanding the development of events in the last times. Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude. What size? A great multitude. And he gives us details, which no one could count. Listen carefully. From every nation. How many? Every nation. From all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They're clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands. Now, here's what we have to understand. You got to see the global scope of what's happening here. Believers from all nations, all ethnicities are found coming out of the great tribulation because of persecution and martyrdom. You say, well, how do you know they come out of great tribulation? Because verse 14 tells us. Look at verse 14. These are those who came out of tribulation, who came out of great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white of the blood of the Lamb. These are Christians that went through the great tribulation, and now they have suffered intensely, dreadfully. Now the beast makes war with God's saints. Look at chapter 13, verse 3. Revelation chapter 13, verse 7. Revelation chapter 13, verse 7. As you're turning there, let me say there has been some of us who were taught that there will be no Christians during the Great Tribulation, only Jews. I don't know how you understand that. I was told that too. You see, that's clearly not what is taught in Revelation chapter 7. That there are multitudes, people, not just from Israel and not just from New York City or Jewish communities, people of every ethnicity, of every tongue, of every tribe. They come out of great tribulation, and there they receive the victor's robe, the white robe, and they're holding palm branches, yet another sign of victory. And we're told clearly, specifically in verse 14, these are those who came out of great tribulation and have washed their robes in the blood of Jesus. Now look at chapter 13, verse 7, please. It was also given to him, this is the beast, we'll get to him in a moment. This was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. Sounds like what we just read, doesn't it? Of course it does. You see, he had authority, look again, over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. Well, one of the most common references to Christians, Christ followers in the New Testament is the word saint. You find it throughout the entire New Testament. In fact, the word Christian is only used 3 times in the entire New Testament. But oftentimes you hear us referred to as saints, holy ones, those who are holy, set apart, dedicated, consecrated as followers of Christ. And look what it says here, that the beast now inflicts harm and death. He engages in spiritual warfare, and it is global. Now, persecution against God's people has caused them to scatter and go underground. This is the way it's been, my brothers and sisters, ever since the beginning of the Christian era. Let me give you a couple examples just of our day and time, if I might. Take China for a moment. In the 1960s, China underwent a cultural revolution, and it violently purged all religions from China. Now, there were soon Christian organizations that were allowed to exist. There's a Roman Catholic form and there's a Protestant form of the church that's allowed to exist in China. But China, the Chinese government underwent kind of a strict effort to utilize the churches to propagate communistic ideology. And when that happened, some of the Bible-believing, New Testament believers that existed in China went underground. They began to worship in house churches. And these began in the rural areas of China. But pretty soon they moved into the large metropolitan cities. And what did you have? You have a strong effort of the Chinese government to eliminate this counter governmental form of Christianity. Now, China still today is one of the greatest violators and offenders of religious liberty. But what we have to understand is that God is moving, despite the persecution against New Testament believers. There is a swell, a grand swell, a movement. God has purified the church in China, and it is growing and moving in an amazing way. And it's not because the church is free. Now take Iran just for a moment. Iran has been a hotbed for ISIS and extreme Muslim groups. It's been a place where there's been severe Christian persecution. Even today, it is illegal to convert to Christianity. It is illegal for Christians to share their faith. It is illegal for Christians to propagate Christian literature. It's illegal for Christians to assemble and gather and speak in Farsi, the native language tongue. You see, despite their being born again believers, and there are many, listen, what we're hearing about what God's doing in Iran is amazing. You see, there is yet another groundswell. The church now is kind of gone underground. It's not so much publicly known, but it is now gone underground, under the surveillance of those that are watching. And oh my goodness, it's secret-ish a bit. And they're hiding a bit, but my, are they proliferating. And see, I want us to see that oftentimes this creates social isolation for so many. In the end times, there will be persecution. And it won't be a virus, it'll be a villain that causes the church to consider scattering and isolating and not being able to gather publicly as we're gathering even today. So let me ask you, how do you think you will respond if you are among the last generation of true believers? Well, I would say most likely we'll meet underground of sorts, not necessarily under the earth, but I mean under the scope of the public sphere. We'll go into some sort of hiding. There'll be isolation for so many. Now let me ask you, how have you responded to the COVID-19 virus? You see, some have lacked Christian fellowship. And if that is you, then let me just say, beware. If you have not continued to remain connected spiritually to your brothers and sisters now in the midst of the COVID pandemic, then let me just say, beware. If you've not joined us for our online worship and Bible studies, and if you've not taken the step to say, I'm making effort, I want to be plugged in, I'm not going to let this virus to eliminate or disconnect me from the source of strength God's given me. But if you've allowed that to happen, then beware. Listen, my brothers and sisters, if you're finding yourself having a tough time getting back at it, you know what I mean? Getting back at it. Things are beginning to open up. People are shopping everywhere now. Of course, there's social distancing and they're exercising care. But I mean, things are beginning to kind of move back. You can just go about any sphere of society now and plug in someplace. And if you're saying, listen, I don't know, I'm having a real tough time here getting back at it, then beware. It'll only get worse in the end. And if you're failing due to spiritual isolation because you cannot meet, you've not been able to meet, and for weeks we were not able to meet, and as a result of that, if you're feeling spiritually isolated, my brothers and sisters, it's time to shore up your faith. It's time to do it now. Don't wait, because this is just a foreshadowing of what's to come when real persecution, when we face not a virus but a villain. So the first connection that we see in the book of Revelation, I believe that's very salient, very clear, is spiritual isolation. Now, I mean of true believers, true followers of Christ. Let's move to our second area, food shortage. Food shortage. You know, as soon as news about the potential, and I want to underscore potential, as soon as news about the potential pandemic hit, the food shortage began. I mean, people flipped their lids about buying food and household supplies. I mean, the area that we find the most disconcerting is the overwhelming grabbing of toilet paper. The toilet paper shortage, right? I mean, women were fighting over toilet paper. Not just women. The photo that you see here are 3 women at Woolworth's supermarket that got into a fight, an altercation that included screaming, hair pulling over toilet paper. Now, I'm going to make a prophecy right here today. This is not normal for me. This is not in character for me. I'm going to make an extra biblical prophecy, and that's this. At the end times, there will be a toilet paper shortage. I'm just comfortable to announce that right here to you today. Now, my brothers and sisters, pardon the levity, because it will be much worse. Go back to chapter 6. Go back to the breaking of the seals, if you would, please. Revelation chapter 6. Seal 7 is represented by the black horseman. And the black horseman represents scarcity. So let's read chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. Chapter 6, 5 and 6. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Now, here is a picture of scales, right? Now, scales was an ancient and a modern means of measure. And a quart of wheat will cost a denarius. Now, this is not our currency today. A denarius was a day's worth of work. That was your labor, your wages for a daily rate. Now, imagine that everything you work for that day, every moment of that day, you are paid, and all you get is the ability to buy a quart of wheat. Now, I've been doing some study, and I didn't come out. Me and Alexa just could not agree on how much wheat it takes to make a loaf of bread. So I went to the better source, other than Alexa. I went to Barbara Green. And I said, "Barbara Green, how much wheat does it take to make a loaf of bread?" And she gave me this enormous recipe, thinking I wanted to make bread. I don't want to make bread, Barbara. I just want to know, how much wheat does it take to make a loaf of bread? And Barbara said, "Just about a quart." Can you imagine working all day to buy a loaf of bread? Those that live on meager means will choose the lesser grain, and that is barley. And barley could be purchased for lesser. But then he says, don't be concerned about really in the sense, the oil and the wine, because the rich folks, those folks with means, I mean the upper crust, the echelon of society, they're going to get theirs. They're going to get the oil and the wine. It's not those that will be suffering as much as those who are working for a living. Now, this is not difficult for us to understand, is it? The COVID-19 virus put men and women out of work. Our economy has tanked. Farmers and supply chains have been drastically reduced. You know, you can't even buy a pack of hamburger today hardly in the grocery store. Sent Bev out to buy some hamburger. We thought we'd grill, and she's a really good griller, by the way. That was supposed to be funny. And so I said, "Dear, go to the grocery, buy you some hamburgers so you can grill." I think that's a great idea, sweetheart. And you know what? I'm not talking about the best choice of steaks. I'm talking about hamburger, for goodness sake. Hamburger. We understand this is a small taste of scarcity. Now, the book of Revelation tells us how scarcity will abound in the last days. Listen carefully. Revelation chapters 8 and 9. If you wish to turn there, you can. I've got to be quick because my time is going to unfold on me. Let me just summarize for you. Trumpet judgment, number 1. In fact, Revelation chapter 8 and 9 identifies the 7 trumpet judgment, the judgments that God's going to allow to be unleashed on the earth. Trumpet judgment number 1 is hail and fire. You find it in verse 7. Listen carefully. 1/3 of the earth's vegetation will be burned. Imagine the scarcity of food if 1/3 of all the earth's products, grains, vegetables are burned and eliminated. Look at trumpet judgment number 2. It falls on the sea in verses 8 and 9. 1/3 of the seas, fish and sea life perish. Trumpet judgment number 3, verses 10 and 11. It falls on fresh water. A third of all the fresh water is polluted and poisoned. And it says many people die. Scarcity. If you turn to Revelation chapter 16, you'll find the 7 bowl judgments. What's the difference? Well, there's some commonality between the trumpet and the bowl judgments. But here you find an intensification of all the terror that's coming to the earth in terms of God's judgments. Bowl judgment number 2, you'll find it in chapter 16, verse 3. It comes on the sea. Now, not a third of sea life is destroyed. All of sea life is destroyed. Bowl judgment number 3, verses 4 through 7, it falls on fresh water. It was a third of the fresh water was polluted and poisoned. But now all sources of the streams and the rivers now become polluted, and all of life in them die. Bowl judgment number 4 describes scorching heat in verses 8 and 9. You'll say, is this global warming, preacher? No. This is not global warming. This is when there is a sudden, however it's caused, the bodies of heaven, the sun, just suddenly has this incredible, intense, burning heat that comes on the earth, and men are scorched, and they cry out in blasphemy against God. Scarcity. Now, guess who controls the food supply in the end? Yes. Yeah, you're right. It's the beast. The beast will control the food supply. Turn to Revelation 13. Revelation 13, 16 and 17. Revelation 13, 16 and 17. And he causes, he being the beast, and he causes all, now listen carefully, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free man and the slaves, to be given a mark on the right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to do what? Buy or sell, except one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. You see, regardless of one's social standing, regardless of one's wealth or pedigree, people will be taking the mark of the beast, and they will take it so they can buy and sell. Now, you know, most people will do just about anything to eat. I think the pandemic has indicated the people will act out of character just to eat. And most people in the end times will take the mark. Why? So they can feed themselves, so they can feed their families. Listen, not only themselves, but their babies, their children, their families. Most will take the mark of the beast. So let me ask you, how have you reacted to the food shortage during this pandemic? You know, when the thing began, we were told, you know, not to hoard items because everyone should get a little before someone has a lot. But that didn't happen. I mean, folks began to hoard, and they began to store up to where you couldn't get the very basic necessities, and you still can't. Listen, this has been multiple weeks now, and you still can't get what you like in the groceries today. You see, in the end times, there's going to be scarcity. And especially those who refuse to take the mark of the beast. There's going to be such scarcity. It's going to require believers who now are worshiping underground, who are committed to follow Christ under the concealment, you see, of their faith and the public attention. You see, there will be a need to share. Listen carefully. The end times is not the era of selfishness for those who desire to follow God. It's an era where caring and sharing is absolutely required. And if you have been a hoarder, and if you have been one who said, I'm going out and I'm getting all I can, and I know others, they've got to fend for themselves. I'm fending for my family. It's for my family, preacher. It's for my family I'm doing that. You are in danger with that attitude on the end times. Because scarcity, food scarcity, has happened and will happen again. So spiritual Isolation is something that we can expect to occur even more when we face not only a virus but a villain. We will see that there will be food scarcity. Third and finally, tight control. Tight control. Tight control of what? Well, tight control of politics and religion. Chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. You know, in the last few weeks, we have seen something that I think most of us thought we never, ever would see. And that is an unprecedented government control. And you see, control has been exercised in the guise of emergency powers. We need emergency powers. You see, that's why so many believe that there has been an overreaching of government power during the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, on April 23rd of this year, USA Today published some of the excesses that has occurred in the last few weeks. Let me just share just three with you if I could. A former police officer of Colorado was arrested for playing catch with his daughter in a virtually empty park. A man was dragged off a bus in Philadelphia for not wearing a mask. A paddle boarder was arrested in Malibu, California, for refusing to vacate the ocean. Now, all of this was done in the guise of saving lives. But then you've got folks being released from jails just so they won't contract the virus. And I'm just trying to figure things out. Now, let's look at political control. First of all, political control. Turn to Revelation 13, if you're not there. Revelation 13. You see, the beast will exert an unbelievable control in the last days. Let's read chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. And the dragon, who's the dragon? The dragon's the devil. You say, how you know the dragon's the devil? Because the Bible tells us so in Revelation 12. A lot of the symbols of Revelation are defined in Revelation. Some folks say you can't read Revelation, you don't understand it because of all the symbols. Most of the symbols are defined. Not all of them, but most of them are. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, one of two beasts, having 10 horns, 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. Now, this beast we know as the political beast. Elsewhere, he's known as the Antichrist. Notice he has 7 heads. 7 is the number of God. It's the divine number. So here, the beast, this political beast, is trying to mimic divine sovereignty. He is with 10 horns. Horns, of course, would represent authority. And so 10 is the number of completeness. So here he is masquerading with complete authority and control. Now notice, on his 10 horns are 10 diadems. A diadem was a crown worn by a king. So here he is. He's presenting himself as some royalty, as some figure that has been placed in the seat of authority. And his reign is global. Now, verse 2 tells us that his authority comes from political alliance. You'll say, I never can imagine that one man is going to have that much influence over the world. Well, he's going to do so by political alliances. If you're interested in this, study the 17th chapter of Revelation. It gives you more detail on how this is configured. Now, it makes sense to me that peoples of the world will follow this alignment of nations led by this one superpower, if you will, this political beast, because of emergency needs. There is an emergency now. The economy is crashing. The nations of the world now are at war. There is famine and starvation and scarcity. We now have got to declare an emergency. So you are required now to fall in line and do as we say. Political control. Makes sense to us, doesn't it? Now let's move to religious control. Look at verses 11 through 18. Time is not going to allow me to read these verses, but you look at Revelation 13, verses 11 through 18, And let me make a comment if I could. These verses describe the religious beast. Yeah, there's a second beast in Revelation. He's also known in the 16th chapter as the false prophet. Now his role is to bring honor and obedience to the political beast. Here we have organized religion as the servant of the state. Here at the end you have the coalescing of government and religion. And they are working and scheming an evil purpose, an ideology, a plan, a globalism that is unfolding and it's masquerading to be an emergency situation for the betterment of all the peoples of the earth. But believers who trust in the Lord Jesus are violently assaulted and attacked. Now here at Liberty, we chose to close our public gatherings of worship because of the virus. Now I want to be as clear to you, my brothers and my sisters, as I possibly can be. As your pastor, I want to be clear. The only reason we closed our worship for the last several weeks is not because Uncle Sam said you need to close, but it was only for the safety of you, our worshipers. That's it. It was to keep you safe. It's to provide you distancing so that you wouldn't contract the virus. That's the only reason. You'll say, well, I thought we're supposed to obey the authorities. Romans chapter 13, obey the civil authority. Of course we obey the civil authorities until they assault the fundamental tenets of our faith. And I assure you, gathering together is fundamental to the Christian faith. Hebrews says, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some of you. This is fundamental. We are the church called out to assemble together to do the work of God. Now those of you worshiping online, we thank God for you. We want to always provide an opportunity for those who are sick and unable to come. And those that are beyond the sphere of proximity to our church. But listen, don't misunderstand this new media ministry of Liberty as an alternative for you to worship in your pajamas. You see, we have been called to a family. And my family is still gathering in Fayetteville, Georgia. And I trust yours is too, of course. And we are a family. In the early midst of the pandemic, the American Bar Association wrote about the constitutional dangers of forcing houses of worship to close. But this didn't stop many governors and mayors. Greg Fitcher, mayor of Louisville, on Easter Day banned drive-in worship in his city. And not only that, but promoted that if you see a violator, rat them out so we can come looking for them. Here on Easter morning, we had drive-in church. We wouldn't have been able to do legally in Louisville. 3 Kentuckians filed a federal lawsuit against Governor Andy Beshear for violating their religious freedom. These 3 believers were members of the Maryville Baptist Church near Louisville. On Easter Sunday morning, they left the church building and found notices under their windshields, quarantine and prosecution. The Kentucky State Police were recording license plate numbers of worshipers. Now, I'm not here to argue politics and policies and practices, but I am here to argue that if you are more committed to obeying the government than you are your Lord, you have a problem. You see, you can't do both in the end times. In the end times, you cannot do both. You'll have to take the mark to buy and sell. There will be an undue degree of control. You cannot do both at the end times. Jesus said you can't serve two masters. Now, here today, we're battling a virus. But someday in the future, we'll battle a villain. And God has graciously given us a test case right here to prepare us for what's to come. Spiritual isolation, food shortage, control are issues that we are faced with today that we will continue to be faced with even in greater means in the future. Are you ready? You know the price. In Revelation, there are two groups, and you know from chapter 19 how the story ends, don't you? You've read chapter 19. You know how it ends. Jesus returns. Those who followed the beast and have taken the mark and followed him loyally will find their way into destruction. Listen, my brothers and sisters, we must be prepared right now today.